So actually, Eleanor Martin, who is the chairman of the board for the Menifee Valley Historical Society, her great-great-grandfather, actually not her great-grand, her great-grandfather actually owned a piece of the ranch that is now Audie Murphy. So she was really actually interested in it. So I won't say this about the ladies, but all you men out there with white hair or no hair, y'all are all old enough to remember Audie Murphy. So does anybody here not know who Audie Murphy was? Wouldn't raise your hand if you didn't.
You're able.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about ooh, what happened? Maybe if I hit the forward button. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Audie and his life, and then a little bit about the ranch and the history of the ranch and the ownership of the ranch. So we'll go through his early life, his World War II, his time in Hollywood, a little bit about his marriage and family life, and then we'll talk about the ranch history, and then his death, and a little bit of time right after. So, Audie was born on June 20th, 1925. But if you look at the 1940 census, it says that he was 6 years old. So that would have put it in 1924. But all of the legend and history of Audie says that he was only 17 years old when he joined the service. So that would make it 25. His driver's license says 25. And Audie told everybody for the rest of his life he was actually born in 1925. But if you read you find a lot of references, and I'll show you one later on, it's a very significant one. It says he was born in 24. So he was the 7th of 12 children. 3 of them actually were born before Audie died in childhood or at birth. His father was, they were sharecroppers, and they didn't have a lot of money. Audie worked as a youngster and as a teenager in the cotton fields, and he hunted to put food on the table. It's what is attributed to him as being a really good shot. He always said if he missed that rabbit, they went hungry. They had 41. So he worked at various odd jobs. And the other children, they went out on their own, and the 3 youngest children was sent to an orphanage near where he was born. He was actually born in the little community of Kingston, which is outside of Greenville, Texas. Actually, it was about 20 miles from where I was born and raised, although I didn't know that until many years later. I'd say he joined the Army at 17 or 18. He really did join at 17, right after Pearl Harbor in 41. He started trying to join. At that time, he was rejected by the Marines. He was rejected by the Navy. He finally, I guess, was accepted by the Army because they needed fodder. But his sister lied about his age to get him in at age 17. So in Texas, and I'm not sure about the rest of the U.S., but in Texas, birth certificates really weren't recorded consistently until sometime after the 1930s. So a lot of people, especially if they were born down in the country, their birth certificate, they just didn't have one. So it was pretty easy for his sister to lie and get him into it. He went through his training at Camp Walters, which is near Fort Worth and Dallas, and then on to Fort Meade. In 43, he was shipped out to Africa. In 43, he invaded Sicily. 43, invaded the mainland of Italy and was wounded. And in 1945, at the Battle of Portsmouth, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. That's probably what most people will remember Audie for, besides his movie time, was that he was awarded the Medal of Honor for that particular battle. Now, the only 2 stories in there, really, I think that's worth telling, is that after they invaded Sicily, it was where he actually killed his first enemy soldier. And 2 soldiers had actually shot and wounded someone right adjacent to him who was a good friend. After they shot him, they turned and ran, and they were running away when Audie shot them in the back. And his commander kind of got onto him and said, "So we don't shoot people in the back." And he said, "Well, they were shooting at me." So Audie was, and people in later life looked at Audie and said, "Look at his eyes." They said that you knew that Audie could kill you without ever actually thinking about it. That he was a combat soldier. The battle in '45, where he was awarded the Medal of Honor, he was had a troop. He was a second lieutenant at the time. He went in as a PFC, went to a private, went to a second lieutenant. But battlefield commissions were pretty quick during those period of times. If your platoon leaders got shot, you got moved up pretty quick. At that particular battle, there was about 6 German tanks and a couple of hundred German soldiers was attacking his squad, which only had about 20 or 30 people in it. And they were being overrun. And Audie, at the time, was also calling in field artillery. He was calling in from behind the lines, the artillery to strike at the Germans. And Audie was actually an excellent judge of distance. I mean, he brought the shells in very, very close to where he was directing his artillery to. Well, as they were about to be overrun, there was an anti-tank gun that had been shot, was actually on fire, and Audie jumped up on top of it and fought off that entire squad of Germans, killing at least 50 of them, according to the witnesses who were there. That tank destroyer was actually on fire. It was loaded with ammunition, and it was loaded with petrol. And he stood up on it and fought them off and actually turned them back. During that time, when the artillery people were screaming at him, "Where are they? Where are they?" It's been said that Audie screamed back into the phone, "Just wait a minute and I'll let you talk to the bastard." So now, you know, these little stories that people tell about people, and we'll get into it in a little bit. You know, how much of it is true, how much of it is, you know, Audie never said that, but other people actually told that story. So he was actually wounded 3 times at that particular battle. And he was shot in the hip and always had a piece of his hip blown away at that particular battle. So he was wounded 3 times in less than 2 years of combat. He was awarded 23 medals or 33 medals, depending upon which reference that you read, and whether or not those included the general medals of good conduct and campaign and victory medals, I don't really know. But he was awarded a large number of medals. He's listed as the most decorated soldier in U.S. history, although there's a couple of other people that received medals later on that may have brought them up to about where Audie was. He was credited with killing over 240 enemy soldiers, but this is one thing that Audie actually did say. He said, "I don't think I killed that many. I don't know how many I killed. There's actually no way of counting them." And he never really liked to talk about that very much. He was discharged in '45. So there's some pictures of his medals. Several stories about his medals is that some people said he threw them away, some people said he gave them away. His sister said that he scattered them out in the blackland dirt around the town where he was born. He did ask for a duplicate set to go to his children. For a while, there was a set on display at the San Antonio Veterans Hospital, which is named after him. And there is a story that Audie was a Mason, and there's a story that those medals are actually on display at the temple in Dallas, although you can't get in unless you're a member. So I don't know if they're there or not. Of the medals that he had there, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor, He received the French Medal of Honor, the Belgian Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and his Purple Heart with a couple of clusters on it for his actual wounds. So after the war, I mean, so he got all these honors during the war. After the war, he also received a lot of honors. He had a postage stamp named after him. He has 2 middle schools named after him, one in Fort Hood and one at Alamo. He has a rose named after him. He has a highway named after him. He has a statue and a museum after him in Greenville, Texas. He has rodeo arenas named after him. He was named to the Cowboy Hall of Fame. There's something called the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club in the Army that's for outstanding NCOs that have shown leadership skills that they can get to. He had a TV series, which we'll talk about later on, called Whispering Smith. Does anybody remember? There were 26 episodes of that. That Atlas missile was named the Whispering Smith after him. VA hospital in San Antonio is named for him. And in 2013, he was given the Texas Legislative Medal of Honor for Texans who had distinguished themselves in the war. And this is Nadine Loki, who is his youngest sister. She's still alive. She's in her mid-80s and accepting that award for him. So after he came home, there were parades everywhere. He came into San Antonio. They had some big plans for him on a bus trip up through Dallas. He slipped out, went in a private car, and went home. They had parades for him in Greenville. They had parades for him in Kingston and Celeste. They had parades for him just about everywhere in East Texas that they could get Audie to come, that he would be honored. Started looking for a job when he got back. He said that there were 2 kinds of people that he talked to: those that wanted to hire him for his war record, his name and his war record, and those that didn't want to hire him because of his war record. But James Cagney in Hollywood saw Audie and thought that he had some potential. So he invited him to come to Hollywood. He actually lived with James Cagney. And the Cagney had a production company, and they paid him $1,500 a month for 1 year. That was his contract. Well, it actually, that first year, he took a lot of acting lessons, but he really never found a part. Finally, the Cagneys decided that he was not going to make it as a movie star. They let him go. So he took he had to live, and he didn't have any money. What he had was a disability check from the military, which he sent back home to the 3 kids which had been in the orphanage. And so he lived in a gym, just took odd jobs to keep going. In '48, he had a small role in a couple of movies. His first big movie in 1949 was Bad Boy. And in 1949, he was offered a $1,500 advance to write his life story in the book To Hell and Back. So he acted in 45 different movies. He actually said that he actually acted in one movie, but he had a different horse each time. He had a TV series. Well, he showed up in some TV series called Star Time, General Electric Theater, Lux Video, 26 episodes of Whispering Smith, and there was a lot of actors, as you can imagine, in those 45 movies that he was with. Gary Cooper, who was his actual growing up, saw Gary Cooper in the Sergeant York, and that was actually his favorite actor. James Arnaz, Burl Ives, Lee Marvin, Tony Curtis, there's tons of them, Denver Powell. So the thing that he actually didn't consider himself a great actor. He said it beats picking cotton. And he really wasn't impressed with Hollywood at all. He didn't really care for a lot of the actors. That wasn't who he liked to hang out with or run around with. And he always really joked about his acting ability. But he did like to put a little bit of reality in what movies when he could. And in The World in My Corner, which was a boxing movie, I don't know how many of you remember that movie, but he actually exchanged some real punches in that movie. His face was marked up, and so was the professional boxer that he was with. So one of the things about Audie was that he was a fast draw artist. Hugh O'Brian actually claimed in the Westerns to be the fastest draw of all of the Western stars, although probably Sammy Davis Jr. and Jerry Lewis were actually probably faster than him. But James Arnaz, Clint Walker, and a lot of others disputed that fact. Rod Redwing, who was a fast draw artist instructor for the Western stars, he said that Audie was the fastest. And Hugh O'Brian always claimed he was, and Audie said he would accept that challenge if they used real bullets. No one took him up on that. The other person that he was a friend with was a guy named Orvo Ohala, who was also another quick draw artist. Most of you have seen him if you ever watched the Gunsmoke movies, because he was the guy that Mr. Dillon killed every time in the opening of the Gunsmoke. But Orvo was actually a holster maker, and he is credited with putting the metal inside of that holster so that it slipped out a lot faster. And his holsters are still being made, but not by him. He's dead, but not by him. So his most successful picture was released in 1955, To Hell and Back, of which he played himself. That was the highest grossing movie for 20 years. Does anybody know what movie replaced it? Jaws. Jaws. He received about a little over $115,000 in cash and 10% of the profits. That movie brought him probably over $1 million. I mean, that was as much money as he...
Big money.
That was big money during that particular period of time. So, what we probably don't know about Audie is that he wrote or co-wrote 17 songs. Now, if you read what Audie wrote, or these songs, or these poems that he's writing, you might forget that he only had either a 5th or an 8th grade education, depending on which reference you actually use. I think he probably had an 8th grade. But his best known songs was Shutters and Boards, that was recorded by Porter Wagner, Dean Martin, Jimmy Dean, lots of people. Was It All Worth Losing You, and When the Wind Blows. Those are probably 3 of the best known songs. They're all tearjerkers. They're all tearjerkers. They're all about lost love. And then his poems, most of them which are not preserved, was Crosses Grow on Anzio, Alone and Far Removed, and Where's Freedom Gone? And all of his poems was about death, and death of his friends, and war, those types of things. So it's kind of interesting. All of his songs were love songs, and all of his poems were much darker. So marriage, his first marriage was to Wanda Hendricks, just several years after he came to Hollywood. She was an aspiring actress, a well-known little actress. And that marriage only lasted about a year. Audie and Wanda were two totally separate people. She was totally into the Hollywood scene. She was a starlet looking to rise. She wanted to go to all the parties. She wanted to see all the right people. And Audie didn't want any of that. And that marriage lasted the rest of the year. Right almost immediately after divorcing Wanda, he married Pamela Archer. Pamela was a stewardess for Braniff Airlines out of Dallas, and was really pretty much a homebody. They had Pam and Audie had two sons, Terry Michael, born in '52, and James or Skip, born in 1954. So his boys are still alive. They're living maybe somewhere in Los Angeles or Northern California. They've totally stepped out of the public life. They don't really talk to anybody about Audie. In fact, you can't find an email for him. You can't find an address for him. You can't find him unless you know one or two of the people that knows him. So his family life, now Audie suffered from what we now know called PTSD. Back then they may have called it shell shock. And that caused him problems his entire life. He had nightmares. He had trouble with sleeping. He got hooked on sleeping pills. He slept with a gun under his pillow. There were a lot of actors, and he kept a gun on the movie set, and there were a lot of actors that wouldn't act with him. They wouldn't be on the set with him because they were actually afraid. His marriage was always trouble with his marriage. And a lot of separations from Pam. They were separated at least 3 times, and I think they were separated actually when he died. But he did spend, in those early days, he did spend a lot of time with his kids. Always tried to provide for them. This is his family. This is Skip on the left, Terry on the right, Audie in the center. And then that's him with Skip and Terry and Pam. There's a lot of photographs around. When I first started trying to put this together, I had trouble finding a lot of photographs. And there was a website which was called the Audie Murphy Research Foundation. But that website was down. It disappeared. And I had found an email of the person who was sort of in charge of that and sent them an email, never got an answer back. And then after I finished all these presentations, I finished the article that I wrote, that website came back up. And it has tons and tons and tons of photographs on it if anybody actually wants to go. A lot more photographs than I've got here. So Audie's problems really in life was he had a lot of financial problems, and he had a terrible gambling habit, primarily on horse races. Although Jack Edom once said that when they were out on a set and there'd be 2 birds setting up on the high line, Audie would bet on which one would fly away first. And he just was a compulsive gambler. His losses sometimes exceeded almost $40,000 a month. And in the mid-'60s, he had to sell his ranches in Menifee and Tucson just to try to pay off his debts. He had a private airplane which was gone. He lost a couple of $100,000 on an oil investment in the Middle East about the time the 6-Day War broke out. He had lifetime earnings of probably close to $3 million, but he was dead broke when he died. And Pam, his wife, had to actually work to try to pay off the debts that he had. She had to sell their home, move into a small apartment. He, I think I'll get to that in a minute. He loved to race. He had jockeys that was racing for him, but Audie also raced his horses. Now Audie had a terrible temper. That's probably somewhat of this is probably associated with his PTSD. part of it. Maybe it was just Audie. But he carried a gun with him almost everywhere he went. Actually, when he was filming the movie The Quiet Man in Saigon in the middle of the Vietnam War, he would take off from the movie set and wander around downtown Saigon with a gun stuck in his back pocket. He once had a racetrack. There were a couple of ladies walked by, and Audie was a womanizer. We can talk about that in a minute. But a couple of ladies walked by, and whether or not Audie looked at him or not, I don't know, but this large Italian guy came up to him and said, "If you look at my wife again, I'll beat the hell out of you." And Audie pulled out his gun and laid it down and said, "You know, I killed a couple of hundred of you bastards, and one more won't bother me." There was a bookmaker who shorted him, and he threatened him with a gun. He was actually tried and acquitted for attempted murder for a man who abused a lady's dog. That lady was one of his girlfriends. And he was acquitted when the defense lawyer said, "A guy with Audie's marksmanship, do you think he could have shot at that guy 5 times and missed?" So he was acquitted, but he actually did shoot at him. Larry Tierney, anybody know who he was? He was a movie actor, big guy, broady, liked to fight, loud, vulgar. And Audie asked him to be quiet at a meeting, and the guy kept going. And if they hadn't pulled Audie out of the room and took his gun away from him, they said he would have shot him on the spot. He always carried a blackjack. He actually was a member of an honorary member of Sheriff's Department and a police department. He participated in drug busts. And this kind of gets back to his PTSD and the fact that if you were ever exposed to the violence of the war, which fortunately I wasn't, it does, according to my friends who were, it gets your adrenaline up to a level that you can't reach it on cocaine or heroin or any other drug, that your adrenaline is running so high. And part of Audie's things was he couldn't find anything that would interest him or get his adrenaline up high to experience what he experienced during the war. And so he did like to go on these drug busts and other places with police departments. He beat up and threatened a couple of men who sent a lewd letter to a friend. Again, this was a lady friend. He beat up a guy who tried to rob him. Now remember, Audie's only about 5'6", 5'7", maybe weighed 110 or 120 pounds. But he wasn't afraid of anybody. So civic contributions. Audie used his star status to actually promote any type of good civic activities for charities. He was really big on trying to help the veterans, especially those that came back from Korea with PTSD. Recruiting, he actually helped in the Army recruiting any type of thing that he could to help the military. After he came back and was actually in Hollywood, he joined the Texas National Guard. When he was discharged, he was a second lieutenant. He ultimately, in the Texas National Guard, made his way up to major. And children, he was very considerate of children. And he even when he was broke and down and out and didn't have a dollar, he refused to do advertisements for cigarettes and liquor. He would not do it at all because he was afraid that it would influence kids that looked up to him. So Audie was, even though he was doing all these things, he was really indifferent to how his life story was told. He just didn't really care. He wasn't really into it. But there was always publicity people out trying to do publicity with Audie, and he went along with most of it. But when I told you about some of the quotes, one of the quoted from a publicity person about one of his movies was that Audie had said that facing a movie camera was harder than facing a German machine gun. Okay? Well, Denver Powell, who actually worked with him, said that Audie told him, said, obviously that guy's never faced a German machine gun. So a lot of those little stories about Audie, you have to take a little bit with a grain of salt. So let's switch over to the Audie Murphy Ranch. So if you don't know where Audie Murphy Ranch is, this is Newport, and this is Murrieta Road. So this whole little area right in here is the Audie Murphy Ranch. So the ranch ownership, that area, for 10,000 years, there was a huge settlement of the Sueño Indians there. That site was abandoned by the early 1800s. During the construction and excavation on that site, there were a large amount of artifacts dug up. There's actually a small area that's been given to the Sueños where all of those artifacts were put back. It was part of the Mission San Luis Rey lands for ranching, and in 1844 it may have been part of a land grant. I'll show you a map here in a minute. It may have been part of a land grant. In 48 it became part of the public domain. 85, part of it was homesteaded by James Farrell, who's Eleanor's grandfather. I know that part of the ranch was granted to a railroad. I didn't attempt to actually go through do a title search of all of the people and all of the parts of the land. But this is the original map for the 1844 land grant. And so this is Lake Elsinore. This is probably Railroad Canyon. And it's the only significant canyon on that map. And so Audie's ranch would have been along in here somewhere. But that land grant was for 13,000.
We can't see where you're pointing.
Okay. How about now? Can you see that? No? That red arrow doesn't show up?
We can't see any of it.
Are you seeing
Are
it?
you seeing a red?
Yeah. Look right in the middle of that lake.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yeah, it's faint, but you can see it.
Okay. All right, so that right there, that blue in the middle, that's Lake Elsinore. And then if you go straight north of that, looks like a canyon. That's probably Railroad Canyon. Okay, these old maps back then were not obviously surveyed. So that land grant was for 3 leagues, which is 13,000 plus acres. That map down on the bottom, at the very bottom, that says 6 leagues. So that covers a lot more land than was actually finally approved in 48, okay, as a land grant to Abel Stearns. But his ranch would have been just north of that canyon, right in that area. So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead. I didn't do any of the research to know who all owned this land. His ranch was about 850 acres. Okay? But that 850 acres in 1940 was purchased by Harold K. and Ida Hemingway, and they raised Caracol sheep. Does anybody know what that is? Nope. How about Persian lamb? How about broadtail lamb? Those very, very expensive fur coats that were made for ladies out of the unborn skin of those lambs are the ones that had been born and were only a day or 2 old. This was a large sheep farm that was there. It was managed by Roland and Nan Sanders. And their son is still alive, and I talked to him a little bit about the ranch. In the second picture on the right, the person on the left is Nan Sanders' grandfather. I mean her father. So in 1951, that ranch was sold to Ellsworth M. Statler. He raised purebred Angus cattle. Does anybody know who Ellsworth was? About the Statler Hilton Hotels. Okay. He was the adopted son of Ellsworth Statler, who started the Statler Hotels, which ultimately became the Statler Hilton chain. He raised purebred Angus cattle there at the ranch. He was the heir to the hotels. He didn't spend a lot of time out at the ranch. He actually lived down near San Diego. He was very active in civic affairs in Paris and in San Diego, and the youth center in Paris is actually named after him. He donated that. So in 1957, Audie Murphy purchased the property, and he called it the AM Farms. Now today they call it the Audie Murphy Ranch. But if you know any about the racing and the racehorses from back on the east coast of Kentucky, they call those farms, horse farms. They don't necessarily call them ranches. He called it the Audie Murphy or AM Farms. The letterhead on it read, thoroughbreds, quarter horses, boarding, breaking, and training. He kept about 30 horses out at that particular ranch. He had another ranch in Arizona, which was actually larger than this one, and he had a small ranch in Texas. The ranch he had in Arizona, when he sold all of his ranches off, he actually sold that to Guy Mitchell, who was in several movies with him. So this is Audie's favorite horse. This is Joe Queen. Joe King was a quarter horse, won a lot of races. One of his other horses that had won a lot of races is called Apache Agent. Each of them probably, I think Apache Agent won about $10,000 in his racing career, and Joe Queen won about the same amount. Now, like I said, his favorite horse was Joe Queen. Now, the interesting thing about Joe Queen is he rode Joe Queen in a number of his movies. But the problem was that Joe Queen was so fast that when they were trying to shoot a scene, he would run off from all the rest of the horses. So they had to get him another horse for that particular scene. He just was too fast. There's a, I think it's, if you go online and look up, I think it's on, You Ask For It. Audie Murphy was on one of the programs with Joe Queen and had someone actually showing off Joe Queen's turning skills. Besides being a racehorse, he was a true working quarter horse. It shows his skills at turning the cattle and pulling one away from the rest of them and keeping it away. That was his favorite horse. He rode him in a lot of parades. So life on the ranch. Audie didn't live on the ranch. They had a house in L.A. Edna, Joe, that's Joe Morgan, Edna, his wife, and Tex Ann, his daughter, who I've talked to his daughter. They lived on the ranch and managed the ranch. Tex Ann was a playmate for his two boys when they would come to the ranch. This is a picture of Terry here in front. That's Tex Ann and Joe and Edna on the horse. When Audie came, sometimes he brought his family with him, and a lot of times he did not bring his family with him. But a lot of times he would bring other horsemen or friends out to the ranch, and Edna would always cook a big plate of hamburgers for him, and Pam really enjoyed talking with Edna and spent a lot of time in her kitchen. And Betty Boris from over in Memphis was a good friend of Tex Ann, and went to the ranch a number of times, and said she can always remember that Edna bringing out those big platters of hamburgers to feed everybody that was there. So again, he spent some time at the ranch. He did a little hunting, did a little trap shooting. This is James Best on the right. That was one of his friends that came out there. Scott Turner, who co-wrote many of the songs with him, would come out there with him. David McClure, who co-wrote To Hell and Back with him, was come out there. The other people that came out with him and that he liked to hang out with was the stuntmen, the cameramen, and the workers on the TV set. Like I said, he didn't really care anything about the Hollywood movie stars. He didn't like to hang out with them, didn't like their lifestyle at all. So this is Audie and Menifee. He was very well liked and respected in the community. He knew a lot of people. He visited all the other ranchers in the area, really talked horses. That was what he did when he came out. He was very down to earth, acted like a local. He didn't introduce himself or anything when he went into to places. He just enjoyed that rural atmosphere and lifestyle. And he did a lot of, he bought all of his horse feed at a store in Paris that was owned by Johnny and Jan Harrison. She said that when Audie would come to the store to buy something, he would come over to the house and that her little girl would just run out and grab him and loved, and Audie would talk to her. She said he was the most down-to-earth person that she'd ever met that was as famous as he was. And that he never talked about his time in the service at all. That most of the people that he met in the Menifee area, he really never talked about it. So the ranch ownership after Audie, he sold it to Bob Hope in 1963 to pay the debts. Same time he sold his ranch in Arizona to pay off his debts. In '84, that property was sold to the Huntington Beach Company, and for several decades they had it in the planning stages for this current development. And I've looked, if you looked at prices of homes there, 2 of those houses, if you bought them, that's what Audie got for the whole ranch when he sold it to Bob Hope. So Audie died in a plane crash in 1971. He had taken a job with a company that manufactured modular homes. He was on the way in Virginia. He was on route to view some of their property when the plane crashed into a hillside. He was the most decorated soldier of World War II. He never liked to say it. If you ask him about medals, he said those guys that never came back are the ones that deserve the medals. He was an actor, songwriter, poet. He really was a legend in his own time. He was a very, very humble person. He did suffer from PTSD his entire life. That's, in my mind, his marriage problems, his gambling problems, his temper problems, a lot of that was associated with PTSD. And he was a very, very strong advocate for veterans' benefits. So this is his wife, Pam. She died in 2010. She worked for the Veterans Administration for 30 years, mainly to pay off Audie's debts. Now, in the plane crash that happened, Pam and his 2 boys were awarded a $2.5 million settlement, but the company that they sued went bankrupt, and so they never got really any money out of it. But she worked for 30 years to pay off the debts of Audie. Pam was a real homebody. She was she liked to stay around home. She liked the family. Like I said, they were separated in several times in the 60s, sometimes for a year, sometimes for 6 months. They were probably separated at the time that he died. But Pam said even with his adultery and desertion, he remained her hero. She stood up for him to the end. So the interesting thing about Audie's grave, again, if you don't see this pencil, you see that says he was born in 24. That's because that's what his military records say, although he was born in 25. And it lists him as a major in the infantry. However, during his time in the service, he rose to second lieutenant. The major was in the Texas National Guard. This gravesite is the second most visited gravesite at Arlington Cemetery, right behind JFK. JFK is the second most. The other thing about it is that if you're a Medal of Honor winner, you can actually have a better marble statue than that. You can have gold leaf on it and other things. Audie didn't want that. He wanted the same thing as a private that was killed. He never really wanted to hear that. So that's all I have. Any questions?
Where was he born, in Texas again?
He was born in Kingston, which really isn't a town. It's near Greenville, Texas. It's east of Dallas. It's between Dallas and Greenville.
Did you say early, or it said early on that he won all those medals and he tossed them away? What was the first bit? That mean he was disdainful, or what did that mean?
He didn't think he deserved the medals. He thought that those guys who died were the ones that deserved the medals. He never really talked about them. Yes, sir.
You know where his property in Arizona was?
Near Tucson. It was a very large piece of property. Actually, what he owned was only about 1,000 acres, but he had leased from the federal government another 15,000 or so. Yes, ma'am.
I probably asked you this last time, but I don't remember. That other ranch in Menifee that got some of his buildings and repurposed them and tried to make like a western town out of it.
That's all BS.
So none of that really is from the
Some
ranch?
of the material for those buildings came from that property, but none of those buildings, which are on the wooden nickel or whatever it is, actually existed on Audie's property.
So where
And that piece of property was not part of the ranch.
we couldn't see your little red dot. Could you give us the parameters of the cross streets and stuff of his branch?
Okay, what's called the Audie Murphy development today is at the intersection of Murrieta Road and Newport Road. And it goes almost all the way to Canyon Lake, and it's on both sides of Newport Road. So all of those 1,000 new houses that's been built in the last 5 or 6 years in there is all part of his ranch. Yes, ma'am.
What did Bob Hope do?
He didn't do anything. When he bought it, he said he was going to raise horses also. But as far as I know, he did. I can't find any reference to him being in the racing business. There were a lot of people in that area that from Hollywood that owned ranches in the Paris area. And of course, John Wayne had a big ranch at Hemet. So
Sage.
there was, but Bob Hope, as far as I know, didn't do anything with it except make a heck of a profit off of it. Yes, sir.
Where was the plane crash and how many people were on the plane too?
It was in Virginia, and there is a monument that's there today. It's along, I think, the National Trail system that runs up through there. There's a monument there. I think there was 5 or 6 people in the plane. They were all associated with this company that he was working for that was into building modular homes. They were going to look at some property. Yes, ma'am.
You know why the plane crashed? Was it bad weather?
It was foggy. There's some question as to whether the pilot was rated for that type of weather or not. That was the gist of the lawsuit.
You had mentioned he was living, and I can't remember what actor, but then they said he wasn't going to be a movie star.
James Cagney.
Okay, so, but then how did he become an actor then? Was he?
Well, he just kept trying, and he landed a couple of bit parts, small parts, and someone saw him in them and thought, you know, he would make a good Western guy.
Which he was.
Which he was.
Well, and then his book, his life story.
Well, that happened, yes, to Hell and Back, when it came out, his book, then they made the movie after it. But that was 55. and he was already making movies before 55.
But he didn't want to star as himself.
He didn't want to star in a movie. He originally did not. They finally talked him into doing it. Okay.